Everyone froze when he said it. "You're nothing but a parasite." I had never heard a man speak to me like that, not even in my worst nightmares. I had driven through the snow-slicked roads of Vermont, heart pounding with anticipation, clutching a small gift for my billionaire uncle, a man whose name alone could make stock markets jitter. The mansion rose above the dark forest like a fortress, lights twinkling like jewels, warm smoke curling from its chimneys. I was supposed to be family tonight, welcomed with open arms, but from the moment I stepped in, something was off. I heard laughter echo through the marble halls, but it wasn't for me. Uncle Robert, a towering man in his 60s with a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, sat at the head of the dining table, golden cufflinks gleaming, flanked by the rest of the family, cousins in designer suits and gowns, all smiling, all perfect. I carried my small, carefully wrapped gift and stepped forward, my hands trembling, trying to catch his attention. His eyes scanned me with icy disdain. "Ah, you're here," he said, the words tasting like venom. I smiled nervously, offering the gift. He waved me off. "I don't need your charity. Why are you here again?" Silence fell like a hammer. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the words hit me like a brick. "You're nothing but a parasite. Taking. Always expecting." The room went silent. My heart dropped. I could feel the judgment of every relative staring at me, whispers brushing my ears like winter wind. I stammered. I just wanted to. "Save it," he barked. "You're leaving before dawn." In that moment, Christmas, which I had always thought was about family, warmth, and joy, became the darkest night of my life. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the snow outside, but I had nowhere to go. I watched my uncle sip his wine, calm and unbothered, as the clock ticked toward midnight. I felt every eye on me, every whisper stabbing my heart. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a public declaration. I didn't belong here, not in this mansion, not in this family, not in this world. By 2 a.m., the storm outside mirrored my inner chaos. I had gathered my few belongings and trudged through the snow, the cold biting my cheeks. Behind me, the mansion glowed, distant and unyielding, a symbol of a life that seemed forever denied. Yet something flickered inside me, a burning question. If this was rejection, could it also be the start of a reckoning? The snow crunched under my boots as I stumbled down the icy driveway, clutching my coat tighter. Every shadow of the towering pines around me felt like eyes, watching, judging. My breath came out in jagged clouds, each one a reminder that I had been cast out of my own family, humiliated, and left without a plan. I kept thinking, how could the man who once called me family treat me like this? The streetlights flickered above the empty Vermont roads, their glow reflecting off the ice like shattered glass. I wandered aimlessly, unsure if I was heading toward a town, a motel, or nowhere at all. The wind tore at my scarf, and I realized that I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a growing fire of rage and confusion inside me. The mansion, now distant, seemed to mock me from afar. I ducked into a 24-hour diner, glowing like a beacon. The smell of coffee and bacon hit me with a strange, bittersweet comfort. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a faded red apron, gave me a soft smile. I sat at the counter, shivering, feeling the sting of tears I refused to let fall. She didn't ask questions, just poured a cup of coffee, and in that small act, I felt seen. I sipped the coffee, letting the warmth spread slowly through my frozen fingers. My mind replayed every insult, every flicker of judgment in my uncle's eyes. Parasite, the word repeated like a drumbeat, relentless. And yet, amid the humiliation, a spark of determination grew. I was not going to let this define me. I would find a way to turn this rejection into something else, a reckoning. Outside, the snowstorm intensified. The town slept, oblivious to my exile. I realized that I couldn't stay in one place. I needed a plan. Somewhere in me, buried under years of being underestimated, a thought emerged. If they saw me as powerless, maybe that was exactly what I could use to my advantage. Tonight, I was homeless, but tomorrow I could be unstoppable. By dawn, I found a bench near the frozen river that cut through the town. I wrapped my coat tightly, shivering, but refusing to sleep. My mind raced. How could I survive? How could I reclaim my dignity? And perhaps more importantly, how could I make the man who called me a parasite regret every word? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain. I wasn't done yet. I pulled out my phone, battery nearly dead, scrolling through messages I hadn't dared open. Friends who had tried to help, old contacts from jobs I'd left behind. Each one was a reminder that even in exile, I wasn't completely invisible. Maybe, just maybe, the universe was giving me a chance to rebuild in secret, to rise higher than anyone expected. By mid-morning, the snowstorm had slowed to a gentle flurry. I walked through the town, boots crunching over ice, eyes scanning every street, every window. My mind was racing, not with despair this time, but with strategy. I remembered every slight from my uncle, every smirk from the family who had watched me get humiliated. If they thought I was weak, they had no idea what I was capable of. I ducked into a small internet cafe, the warmth hitting me like a punch. The place smelled of coffee, old carpet, and desperation, strangely comforting. I logged into old accounts, dusting off contacts I had ignored, and began mapping out a plan. Investments, business connections, social networks. Even a small seed of capital could grow into something no one would see coming. Tonight, I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing. I remembered the glimmer in my uncle's eyes when he flaunted his wealth. The arrogance, the belief that money equaled power. If I could quietly build something he couldn't touch, then his words, his insults, would bounce off me like stones thrown at glass. I gritted my teeth, feeling the first taste of righteous fury. It was no longer anger, it was focus. Hours passed as I researched, made calls, and traced potential opportunities. Each lead felt like a stepping stone, each strategy a secret weapon. By the time the sun began to set, I had crafted a small but viable business plan. A way to invest, to grow, to prove my uncle wrong without anyone knowing it was me. This was no longer about survival. It was about power and vindication. Outside, the town's lights twinkled against the snow-covered streets, almost like a miniature city beneath a glass dome. I felt a strange thrill. This was my world now, my sandbox. And somewhere inside me, a voice whispered, "They think you're nothing. Let's show them everything." My exile had turned into an opportunity. Every insult, every dismissal, every word of disdain was fuel for what I was about to become. That night, I returned to the diner for a second cup of coffee. The waitress smiled, handing me a steaming cup without a word. I realized she didn't need to know my plans. No one did. Secrecy would be my ally. And as I sipped the coffee, I plotted the first steps of my revenge. Not petty revenge, but the kind that would leave my billionaire uncle speechless, the kind that would rewrite who had power in the family. By the time I left, darkness had settled over the town. Snowflakes clung to my coat like tiny stars. I knew the road ahead would be hard, maybe impossible. But for the first time since being called a parasite, I felt a pulse of hope and exhilaration. The world had written me off, but I was about to rewrite it myself. Tomorrow would be the day I began my ascent. The next morning, I woke in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the town, the walls thin, the heater humming. It smelled faintly of mildew and old coffee, but it was safe. For the first time in days, I felt the thrill of control. I spread out a notebook, scribbled numbers and names, and mapped a path from nothing to leverage. Each contact I reached out to was a thread. Together, they could weave a web strong enough to catch anyone, even Uncle Robert. I began making calls to old colleagues and acquaintances, carefully framing myself as a professional, someone ambitious and resourceful. No one needed to know I had just been kicked out in the snow. Each connection was a potential ally, a potential investor, a potential weapon in the game I was about to play. With every yes I earned, I felt the sting of humiliation fade, replaced by a rising tide of empowerment. By noon, I had secured a small freelance project with a boutique investment firm. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a foothold in the world my uncle dominated. Every dollar I earned, every skill I sharpened, was a strike against the man who had called me a parasite. I smiled, knowing he believed I was helpless, and that made every step sweeter. The afternoon brought an unexpected twist. A message popped up from a distant cousin, one who had quietly admired me despite the family's disdain. She warned me that Uncle Robert had already begun talking about me behind closed doors, spinning lies to justify his cruelty. But she also hinted at resources the family had overlooked, assets I could access if I played my cards right. Suddenly, the game had depth I hadn't imagined. That night, I scouted the town for opportunities. The streets were empty, save for a few late-night drivers and snowplows. I realized that power was rarely given. It was taken, often quietly, invisibly, while others slept or mocked. And if Uncle Robert thought I was powerless, he had just handed me the greatest advantage of all: invisibility. Back in my motel, I began designing the first phase of my plan. a combination of strategic investments, discreet social networking, and leveraging overlooked opportunities in my uncle's empire. Every detail mattered, every move had to be precise. One misstep could ruin everything, but the taste of potential triumph was intoxicating. By the end of the fourth day, I felt a shift inside me. The powerless, rejected kid who had shivered in the snow was gone. In his place stood someone sharper, faster, and hungrier. A man or woman, capable of outmaneuvering a billionaire. Uncle Robert's words still stung, but they were no longer chains, they were fuel. The sun had barely risen when I slipped out of my motel, laptop and notebook tucked under my arm. The town still slept, unaware that a storm of change was about to be unleashed. My first strike would be quiet, invisible to everyone, except Uncle Robert. I had tracked an overlooked property investment linked to his company, a vulnerability buried under layers of accountants and lawyers. Tonight, I would plant the seed of disruption. I ducked into a small co-working space downtown, rented for just a few hours. The room smelled of coffee and printer ink. I logged into multiple accounts, executing the first part of my plan. Subtle trades, discreet communications with key contacts, careful positioning to leverage assets without alerting anyone in the family. Every keystroke felt like a strike against the arrogance that had once humiliated me. By mid-morning, I received confirmation that the first part of my plan had succeeded. A minor investment, previously overlooked by Uncle Robert's empire, had shifted slightly under my influence, enough to disrupt the control he assumed he had. I allowed myself a small smile. This wasn't just money. It was proof that the parasite could move unseen, silently reshaping the world around him. As the day progressed, I met with a former colleague from a tech startup. He had been quietly running a small venture on the outskirts of Vermont, and together, we began sketching out a joint project. Something ambitious, something Uncle Robert would never anticipate. The plan was simple: leverage technology, small-scale investments, and timing to gain leverage in a world that had dismissed me. Every detail had to be precise. Failure was not an option. By evening, my phone buzzed with messages from contacts I hadn't even realized were listening. They had noticed subtle market shifts, small movements that only a sharp eye could detect. I smiled privately. This web I was spinning was invisible, yet far-reaching. Uncle Robert had no idea that the first domino was about to fall, and I was savoring every quiet moment of anticipation. That night, I returned to my motel, exhausted but exhilarated. I pored over spreadsheets, recalculated projections, and refined strategies. Each successful move gave me momentum, each subtle victory a surge of confidence. The humiliation of Christmas Eve was no longer my anchor. It was my fuel. The parasite was no longer begging for scraps. He was setting the table for a reckoning. Before falling asleep, I looked out the window at the snow-covered town. Quiet, peaceful, unaware that change had begun. I whispered to myself, "This is just the beginning." Uncle Robert had underestimated me, mocked me, and cast me out. But soon he would see that every insult, every cruel word, had only sharpened my resolve. By the following morning, the air in the town seemed sharper, cleaner, almost electric. I checked my emails and accounts with a sense of anticipation that made my pulse race. Small shifts had already started to ripple through Uncle Robert's holdings. Investments he thought were untouchable had subtly changed hands. He had no idea that the parasite he dismissed was orchestrating a quiet storm. I received a discreet message from the boutique firm I had connected with earlier. Unusual activity detected. Someone's influencing previously unnoticed assets. A smile tugged at my lips. That was the first crack in the armor of the billionaire who had humiliated me. Every detail, every calculated move, had led to this moment, the first visible ripple of my silent revenge. By noon, I ventured out to meet another potential ally, a local business owner who had once been dismissed by Uncle Robert's empire but secretly resented him. She agreed to share resources and insight, impressed by my discreet approach. Each alliance I formed was like adding a stone to a dam. The pressure was building, and when it broke, the flood would be unstoppable. Meanwhile, Uncle Robert had started hearing whispers of irregularities, slight disruptions in cash flow, minor anomalies in investments. He called his assistant in a fury, demanding explanations. Little did he know the explanations existed, but I controlled them. His confidence, which had always been unshakable, was beginning to falter. That evening, I returned to my motel room, reviewing the day's developments. Each subtle movement, each careful step was working. Uncle Robert's empire had blind spots, and I was exploiting them quietly and visibly. The humiliation of Christmas Eve had been replaced by exhilaration, the thrill of power finally within reach. Later that night, I reflected on how far I had come in less than a week. From being thrown into the snow, powerless and mocked, I had become a shadow moving through a billionaire's world, unnoticed yet dangerous. Every contact, every strategic investment, every subtle maneuver was a step closer to reckoning. Uncle Robert had underestimated me, and his arrogance would be his undoing. As I drifted to sleep, I made a silent promise. The next time we met, it would not be in a mansion where I was humiliated. It would be on my terms, with the power and influence I had quietly amassed, and Uncle Robert would have no choice but to face the consequences of underestimating me. By the 7th day, my influence had quietly spread through several overlooked assets of Uncle Robert's empire. From the outside, everything seemed untouched. To him, life went on as usual, his family oblivious, his parties glimmering with false security. But behind the screens, the emails, the transactions, a silent revolution was underway, orchestrated by the one he had called a parasite. I met secretly with an old mentor, someone who had taught me the subtle art of influence and timing. He smiled knowingly as I outlined my progress. "You're moving in the shadows, but shadows have teeth," he said. Every word reinforced the power I now held, the kind that could dismantle confidence, reputations, even billion-dollar empires without anyone realizing who pulled the strings. Meanwhile, Uncle Robert began to notice anomalies. Slight dips in revenue, minor shifts in investments. Things too subtle for his accountants to detect immediately. He frowned in frustration, calling meetings, demanding explanations, pacing like a caged lion. The empire he believed untouchable was trembling under the weight of invisible hands I controlled. By midweek, my network had grown. Small investors, local entrepreneurs, and even distant relatives quietly aligned with me. Each one was a piece of the puzzle, unseen but powerful. I could feel the first threads of leverage forming, weaving a trap that would not only humiliate Uncle Robert publicly, but also challenge the very foundation of his control. That night, I reflected on the irony. The very words that had cut me, parasite, had become the armor I wore. Every insult, every humiliation, had fueled the meticulous, invisible strategy that now positioned me above the man who had thrown me into the snow. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of consequences. I sent a carefully crafted message to a key shareholder connected to Uncle Robert's empire, framing an opportunity that seemed benign but would subtly shift control away from him. By morning, the first domino outside my immediate network had already tipped. The empire was beginning to wobble, and the man who had called me a parasite had no idea why. As I lay in bed that night, I imagined the look on Uncle Robert's face when he realized the scope of what had happened, how the invisible force he had ignored and mocked was now reshaping everything around him. The thought made my pulse quicken. Revenge, power, and justice were no longer distant. They were in my hands. The morning started like any other, but by the afternoon, the first ripple became a wave. Uncle Robert's assistants were calling frantically, his accountants scrambling, and whispers circulated among the family. Something unusual was happening. The empire they had always assumed was untouchable was subtly shifting, and the invisible hand orchestrating it, me, was still nowhere to be seen. I watched the news quietly from my motel room, sipping coffee. A local financial report mentioned minor irregularities in assets tied to a Vermont-based conglomerate. Uncle Robert had no idea these shifts were the work of the very family member he had called a parasite. The irony was intoxicating. Every insult had become a stepping stone, and the first public tremors of change were only beginning. By evening, I arranged a discreet meeting with another ally, a young, ambitious analyst who had once been overlooked by Uncle Robert's firm. She agreed to share insider knowledge in exchange for a subtle stake in the opportunity one was creating. Each partnership I formed tightened my grip, preparing for a confrontation that would expose the arrogance and cruelty that had been hidden behind gold-plated walls. Uncle Robert, meanwhile, was growing desperate. Every phone call seemed to reveal another anomaly, every report another shift he couldn't immediately control. The word parasite must have haunted him silently, because he was beginning to suspect that someone he dismissed was quietly undermining him. Little did he know, the person was sitting miles away, calm, precise, and completely invisible. That night, I orchestrated the first public nudge, a subtle but impactful financial maneuver that drew media attention to a minor, previously unnoticed subsidiary of Uncle Robert's conglomerate. The family panicked, the board demanded answers, and rumors began to circulate, all without anyone tracing the action back to me. The humiliation I had endured now felt like poetic justice in motion. As the first week of my plan's execution closed, I reflected on how far I had come. The powerless, snow-shivering kid who had been kicked out on Christmas Eve was gone. I had transformed into a strategist, an unseen force moving through a billionaire's world, leaving ripples of chaos behind. The reckoning wasn't just coming, it was already in motion. I closed my eyes that night, imagining Uncle Robert's disbelief as he began to connect the dots, realizing that the person he humiliated, mocked, and rejected was orchestrating every move. The thrill of that anticipation was a fire I would carry into every next step. The parasite had become the predator. The invitation arrived quietly, hand-delivered, marked with the family crest. Uncle Robert's private office in the mansion, the same place I had once been humiliated. My heart raced, but not with fear. This was anticipation, the thrill of a long-awaited reckoning. I stepped out of my car into the snow, the familiar mansion looming above, lights twinkling deceptively calm. Tonight, the parasite would have a voice. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood, expensive leather, and false security. Uncle Robert rose from his desk, shock flickering across his face. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, trying to mask the unease I had cultivated. I smiled, calm, confident. "I'm here to finish what you started, and what you underestimated." I laid out the evidence, the subtle shifts, the invisible maneuvers, the partnerships I had forged, the dominoes falling across his empire. Every move, every strategic calculation, every investment had been orchestrated quietly while he laughed, blind to the storm. The room went silent as realization hit him. The person he humiliated had outsmarted him in his own domain. Uncle Robert's face darkened. You've been behind this?" he growled, disbelief and fury mingling. I nodded. "Yes. The same person you called a parasite. The same person you threw into the snow. And now, I'm standing here, in control of opportunities you thought were yours alone." He lunged for authority, trying to dismiss me, threaten me, assert dominance. But every step he took was anticipated. Every word he spat was countered with calm, precise evidence. My allies, investors, analysts, and even overlooked family members had shifted the balance. The power dynamic had changed entirely. The humiliation I suffered had been reversed, amplified, and perfected. Finally, Uncle Robert slumped back, defeated, realizing that his arrogance and cruelty had led to this exact moment. The parasite was no longer beneath him. It was the one dictating terms, silently controlling the boardroom, and exposing the vulnerabilities he had always ignored. The family who had watched me with disdain had no choice but to acknowledge my strength and cunning. As I left the mansion that night, snow crunching under my boots once again, the weight of the past lifted. The humiliation, the cold, the exile, they had all been transformed into a lesson in resilience, strategy, and silent power. I had turned rejection into authority, cruelty into opportunity, and the parasite into a predator. The morning after the confrontation, the mansion was silent. Uncle Robert, once the embodiment of arrogance, now faced the reality of his empire quietly shifting out of his hands. Board members had begun making decisions without his input, investments were rerouted, and the parasite he had mocked was now the architect of a subtle, unstoppable transformation. The humiliation I endured had been avenged, not with theatrics but with precision. I returned to the small town, the snow crunching beneath my boots, and for the first time in weeks, I felt free. No longer chasing validation, no longer shivering in the cold, I had created a network, a strategy, and influence that even my billionaire uncle could not ignore. The exile had been my crucible. Out of it, I had forged clarity, resilience, and power. Friends, allies, and distant relatives who had once watched silently now acknowledged my rise. The young analyst, the former colleague, and the local business owner, each had become part of a quiet but formidable force. Together, we had not only reclaimed what was lost but created something entirely new, something no one could dismiss. The parasite was no longer a label. It was a crown of resilience and strategy. News of the subtle upheaval began reaching the press. Analysts discussed mysterious shifts in investments, praising the unexpected strategy behind them. Uncle Robert was left scrambling, his confidence shattered. He had underestimated me, as he had underestimated so many who seemed powerless. But I had turned invisibility into strength and ridicule into strategy. That evening, I stood on a small hill overlooking the town, snow falling gently around me. The cold that had once felt like rejection now felt like liberation. I had survived humiliation, rebuilt from nothing, and risen stronger than anyone expected. The lesson was clear. Power is not always about wealth or status. It is about strategy, resilience, and turning every slight into opportunity. Uncle Robert, meanwhile, faced the consequences of arrogance. Family members who once deferred to him now recognized my authority, and his empire had quietly shifted under my influence. He was no longer the unchallenged titan he had believed himself to be. Every insult, every dismissal, every cruel word had returned as a lesson in humility, and a testament to the power of resilience. As night fell, I sent a final message to my allies. The work was far from over, but the victory was mine to savor. From a single night of exile in the snow, I had transformed into a force no one could ignore. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the world, the story of the Parasite, rising to power, began to ripple, inspiring those who had ever been underestimated or cast aside. If you've ever turned rejection into triumph, tell us where you're watching from, because this story proves that the strongest power comes from resilience, strategy, and the refusal to be ignored.